Howdy, folks. This is Miss Sinclair from Miss Sinclair's History. Today, we are starting period 4, which looks at the time period from 1800 to 1848. We are going to look specifically at the era of Jefferson to begin with. Now, a couple of notes from me in regards to pacing and these videos or podcasts. Quick reminder, you can listen to these lectures just as a podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or if seeing the PowerPoint slides and sort of the notes and images is helpful for you, you can find those on YouTube as well. You may notice that while I try to get out 2 episodes a week, things sometimes are a little sporadic. I apologize for that. I'm going to continue to aim for 2 lessons a week. I know that means I am falling further and further behind. So if you are currently teaching APUSH, or if you are an APUSH student, you may have heard the phrase, your goal is to kill Lincoln by Christmas. Generally for APUSH teachers, that is our goal in terms of pacing. So you don't necessarily need to be done with Unit 5, but you need to have at least finished the Civil War by, you need to have killed Lincoln by winter break. And even if that means you finish up with Reconstruction in January. I always tried to pace it. So I finished Unit 5 in December. And in January, it allowed me to pick up with Unit 6. Clearly, this is not the pace I'm going at with these videos or podcast episodes. So I appreciate your patience with me. I do this in my free time. So as life gets busy, this sometimes gets pushed to the wayside. But hopefully it can continue to be an asset for you. If not this year, then maybe next year. So let's get into it then. We are on topic 4.2, looking at the rise of Jefferson. So my question for you is, what made the election of 1800 remarkable? Think about this. It is a big deal election. There's a lot of elections in US history. There are very few that you should know. You should know the election of 1800. You should know the election of 1860. You should know the election of 1904. 2000 as well. But if some of the other presidential elections slip past you, it's not necessarily the biggest deal. You should probably also know 1876. But 1800 and 1860 are the big ones too. You need to know who was running and what happened. The election of 1800 was a big deal because you had a shift in power. It was a bloodless election. You went from having the Federalist Party and John Adams in power to now Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans in power. And no one was killed. No one was slaughtered. There was no riots in the streets. There was no civil war. There was no insurrection, right? Federalists didn't storm the Capitol building. They just let power shift from one party to another. And this is something that is remarkable. This hadn't happened in world history, right? The Federalist and Party had dramatically different goals and even understanding of the Constitution and how the country runs when compared to the Democratic Republicans. So the fact that they willingly gave up power and no need for bloodshed, that's huge. All right, so topic 4.2 is a big one. We're just going to start with talking about Jefferson, the Jefferson administration. So I would like you to describe the major events of the Jefferson administration and their impacts. Let's talk about America in 1800. We see that population is booming. By 1810, the population of the United States is 7 million. We also see Western expansion. By 1809, 4 new states have been added to the Union. People are moving west. We see in general that the prosperity of the nation is increasing, more agriculture, more commerce. You see Thomas Jefferson winning the election and immediately moderating his tone, right? In his inaugural address, he says, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." He is trying to be like, look, we're all in this together. I know it was a nasty election, but we're all Americans first, essentially is what he's saying. He pardons all of the martyrs of the Alien and Sedition Acts, lets them out of jail. He only elects Democratic Republicans to his cabinet. So what are his early domestic policies? Well, one of the things is to, actually pause. Let me pause before we jump into his early domestic policies. And let's spend a moment just talking about Thomas Jefferson, the man. Thomas Jefferson, as a man, is a really fascinating historical conundrum for teachers and students and anyone who studies US history, because he was no doubt brilliant. He was an incredibly gifted speaker. He was a gifted writer. He was a musician. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He helped negotiate support from France, right? He is one of our key founding fathers. There is language that we recognize that is going to be like the separation of church and state. That's language from Jefferson. He writes it in the Virginia Constitution. He says there should be a high wall of separation between church and state. On the other hand, he's a slave owner. He's from Virginia. He has a plantation. Over the course of his life, he owns about 600 human beings, right? He sells slaves he sold about 110 people over the course of his life, right? Sure, people might point to the fact that over the course of his life, he does reduce the number of slaves he has, right? People might say, well, as far as slave owners go, he wasn't the worst of them. He is quoted as saying, "My first wish is that laborers may be well treated." He gave his slaves Sundays off and Christmas off. But, his plantation had a small factory, industry where they made nails to hammer, carpentry, and it was staffed only by slave children, right? So this is the conundrum, because two things are simultaneously true about Thomas Jefferson. He was a brilliant reader and writer. He made important and crucial political and philosophical contributions to the foundation of our country. We can recognize that and appreciate that. And simultaneously, he was a slave owner who owned 600 human beings over the course of his life, who enslaved and worked children. And then, of course, there's his relationship with Sally Hemings. So let's talk a little bit about historiography. For a long time in US history, Thomas Jefferson was just everyone's favorite. There was always some rumors, like even in the election of 1800, there was some question about his relationship with slaves, but everyone basically figured that was just a lie to try and make him look bad in the election. There was never any really good evidence about it until, I think it was the 90s. In the 90s, the descendants of Thomas Jefferson and his slave, Sally Hemings, they had been pushing for sort of recognition that, like, no, Thomas Jefferson did have children with Sally Hemings. And there's no way to prove it until you have the emergence of DNA testing, in which case known descendants of Thomas Jefferson's daughter and these African-American descendants who claimed to be related to Thomas Jefferson, they both had their DNA tested. And it turns out, yep, they're true. They weren't lying. Thomas Jefferson had children with one of his slaves. So since the 1990s, there's been this whole reevaluation with Thomas Jefferson, how we view him, how we view his relationship with slavery, right? People recognize the fact that Thomas Jefferson wasn't necessarily a fan of slavery. He said it's like holding a wolf by the ears. On the other hand, he never got rid of his own slaves. So let me tell you a little bit about who Sally Hemings is. Sally Hemings was one of Thomas Jefferson's slaves. And she was an African woman. She was biracial, right? So in fact, the children that she has with Thomas Jefferson, some of them will be white passing. Right? Sally Hemings was about 75% white. She was actually half sister to Thomas Jefferson's deceased wife. And according to Abigail Adams, she looked a lot like Martha Jefferson, right? So obviously Martha Jefferson's father had a child with one of his slaves. That child was Sally Hemings. Then Thomas marries Martha, et cetera, et cetera. So Martha Washington dies when early on, and Thomas supposedly he just loved Martha. She leaves behind a daughter. So when Thomas Jefferson goes off to France, he takes his daughter with him, and he wants to bring slaves with him. Now, this is actually kind of risky to do because slavery was illegal in France. So any slaves he brought with him could have just walked out and been free in France and stayed in France. Sally would have been about 14 when she went out there. So that means she's younger than Jefferson's teenage daughter. For all intents and purposes, it seems that in France, Sally Hemings, this teenage girl, right, this 14-year-old girl, is going to be able to leverage the sexual relationship that Thomas Jefferson starts having with her, right? Because she could leave. But instead, what she does is something that's super brave and courageous. She agrees to stay and continue to have this sexual relationship with Thomas Jefferson. In response, or like in return, Thomas Jefferson is going to free any children that they have together once they turn 21. They have 6 kids together. Now, Sally's going to remain a slave all of her life. He never frees her, right? He has a sexual relationship with her since she's a teenage girl. He is the father of 6 of her 6 children, and yet he never frees her, right? You have to, this is that weird dichotomy. It's so hard to understand, like how do you compartmentalize like this, right? He would visit his home and see his slaves, and some of those slaves would be his own children. He enslaved his own children until they were 21, and then he allowed them to go free. It is it's complicated. It's complicated. It is. And whether or not this should be their sexual relationship should be described as rape is something that also gets debated. But here's what we do know. She was a teenage girl who had no ability to say no. The whole idea of consent, that no means no, means you have the ability to say no, that you can say, hey, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to have sex with you. I don't want to be touched like this. And if the person continues to force sexual contact with you after you have said no, that's rape. But what happens when the power balance is such that you cannot say no? You cannot say no. She couldn't say no. Now, whether there was any affection between them, we don't know. Whether over the course of her life, she said yes, right? I mean, clearly she was able to negotiate with him a deal. In exchange, she would continue to have a sexual relationship with him as long as he promised to free any children that they had together. So does that mean she gives consent? But he is still her owner. At any point, he could have sold her children off. He could have gone back on his word. He could have never freed them. He could have sold her, right? Two things are true about Thomas Jefferson. He makes important, valuable contributions to the founding of America. He's going to double the size of the country. He was incredibly smart, and you can spend your entire lifetime studying his contributions to the United States, and they are valuable, and he should be recognized for that. And he was a person who owned other human beings, who bought them, who sold them, who raped a teenage girl who he brought with him to be friends with his daughter in a foreign country, who enslaved his own children, who bought and sold and owned 600 people. This is why history is so important to study, because it's not black and white. You can't be like, oh, well, Thomas Jefferson's a good guy. Well, he's a bad guy. Okay, well, you have to decide for yourself, does his actions as a slave owner invalidate all of his contributions to the founding of America? Or does his contribution sort of outweigh the evils he did? How do you weigh the abuses of humanity, right? He's not just like, oh, I don't know, laundering money or something like that. He's owning and abusing other human beings, including children, right? Well, gosh, but okay, well, do we apply that same level of scrutiny to the other slave owners who were founding fathers? George Washington, James Madison. How many slaves would you have to own for it to invalidate your contributions? Is it 1-to-1, right? For every one slave you own, it invalidates one contribution. It's not easy. And so what we are left with as students of history is the two things are true. We acknowledge that he did evil things, that slavery was an evil act, and he participated in it. And he helped create a country and supported a system that will eventually allow for the ending of slavery. So, like I said, complicated guy. All right, enough about Sally Hemings. Let's talk a little, and if you want to dig more into that, there are so many books. Early domestic policies. One of the things you're going to see about Thomas Jefferson, if you're looking at the video, you're going to see his presidential portrait. He's not wearing a wig. He is very down to earth in many ways. No wigs, no pomp, no circumstance. He answered the door himself. He got rid of a bunch of taxes, lowered the national debt. Thomas Jefferson's vision for the country was that we would be a nation of farmers, right? Small agricultural communities, not big cities, not banks, not industry. He thinks that's a huge problem. He cuts the Navy, he cuts the Army. He has problems with some pirates in North Africa, and that makes it hard to do trade with Europe. And because he got rid of the Navy, there's kind of nothing to do. And then, of course, there's his biggest action in office. Oh, I said these, which is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase. Oh my gosh. It doubles the size of the country. So the territory west of the Mississippi had gone back into the control of France after Napoleon conquered Spain. So everything west of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, excluding the Spanish Southwest. Napoleon had this vision for creating a French America, right? Using sort of New Orleans as the starting point to create his own sort of competitor to the United States. But he loses interest in this by 1803 because he needs resources to fight England. His last effort to try and deal with colonies was a failure when he tried to retake Haiti and all of his soldiers died of yellow fever. Jefferson has a lot of interest in it. Settlers were relying on the Mississippi River, and this becomes a problem when Spain closes the port of New Orleans to Americans in 1802. He was worried that the US would continue to get involved in European issues as long as Europe held New Orleans. As long as Europe controlled the Mississippi, the United States couldn't be isolationist. So Otto von Bismarck, German politician who unified Germany at the end of the 19th century, is quoted as saying, "God watches out for fools, drunks, and the United States of America." Thomas Jefferson sends diplomats over to France to offer to buy just the city of New Orleans and the coastline to Florida for $10 million, right? That's it. If they fail, they're going to go to Great Britain and start negotiating an alliance. France, though, is so desperate for money that they said, look, we'll give you all of the Louisiana territory for $15 million, right? So compare that. We are offering $10 million for just one city and a little bit of coastline. And France is like, for 15, we'll give you it all. The American diplomats say, yep, without even asking, without even having the authority. Now, this makes sense for France strategically as well. They need money for their fight with England. And this also prevents the United States from going and making an alliance with Great Britain. So America gets a smoking deal. $15 million for 825 square miles. We would have taken the land anyway. But is this constitutional? Well, oof. Is this simply practical, or is Thomas Jefferson hypocritical? Remember, Thomas Jefferson is the guy who is a strict constructionist. Hamilton's the loose constructionist, meaning that if Jefferson believes that if the Constitution doesn't say he can explicitly do something, he believes as president, he does not have the power to do it. Please show me where in the Constitution it says that a president can unilaterally expand the territory of the country without the consent of Congress. Let me answer that question for you. It doesn't say he can do that, right? That is the kind of thing that is very clearly the actions that only Congress can take. And yet, when push comes to shove, when the offer comes, Jefferson doesn't follow his values. You know, he claims to believe in a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. When the opportunity comes along, he's just like Hamilton. Would it have been a problem if everyone wasn't so excited about it? Maybe, but everyone approved of his decision, so his hypocrisy kind of gets overlooked. So what happens? Well, he sends off his good friend, Meriwether Lewis, and Lieutenant William Clark to go out west and explore. Lewis is intellectual and a scientist. He has grown up next door to Jefferson and grew up using his library to study. So it was primarily a scientific journey. Lewis kept detailed notes of like sky patterns, elevation changes, weather, flora, fauna. He sent samples of animals and plants back east, made lots and lots of maps. Jefferson convinces Congress to fund all this, and Lewis and Clark make it out to the Missouri. And at that point, they're like, all right, we need a translator because we know we're going to be encountering indigenous peoples and we don't speak the language. So they hire a French fur trapper, and they realize actually the more valuable part to what he offers is his wife. His wife, Sacagawea, was actually from further west. She spoke many of the indigenous languages, and she will act as their guide and translator. She is going to play an integral part of their exploration. They set out from St. Louis, they cross the Rockies, they eventually reach the Pacific Ocean on the Oregon coast. They go up along the Missouri River. So they go north, right? They don't go out. It's a little bit easier for them to get across the Rockies in the north with the rivers than in further south. You end up with the deserts and the Utah Plateau and all those things. Plus, you start to get close to Spanish. It's pretty cool. All right, let's talk a little bit about Jefferson's second administration. Election of 1804. Well, the Federalists are basically gone now. There's really only one political party, and you would think this would mean everything would run smoothly. There's no political opposition. It turns out that's not the case. You have the emergence of a group of politicians called the tertium quids, which quite literally means third something. These are politicians who have broken away from the Democratic Republican Party under the leadership of John Randolph, who is actually a cousin of Jefferson. He is the ultimate Republican and thinks Jefferson is frankly too moderate and is breaking his own rules. Look at the Louisiana Purchase, right? So the tertium quids believe in states' right and a strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. You then have other scandals like the Yazoo land fraud case, where it turns out corporations want land, so they bribe the Georgia government to sell them land in present day Alabama and Mississippi. And then the Yazoo Land Company turns around and sells this land to many people. Well, when it turns out that entire Georgia legislature is corrupt and they all get fired and a new legislature is voted in, the new legislature cancels all the contracts. We'll eventually go to court, the Supreme Court in Fletcher v. Peck. But Jefferson just wants to pay off the cost, so sort of let it lie. And Randolph thinks, look, you're just as corrupt as everyone else. We haven't talked a lot about the Supreme Court yet, but in the court case, Fletcher v. Peck, the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall upholds the sales contracts. He says, look, these contracts are valid. You can't cancel a contract that wasn't illegal at the time, right? So he's expanding and strengthening Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. Then on the other extreme, from the tertium quids, you have the Essex Junto under the leadership of Senator Thomas Pickering. A group of ardent Massachusetts Federalists consider seceding from the Union. This is the first group of people who want to secede, and it doesn't go anywhere. But One of the things we haven't talked about yet is, of course, the midnight appointments, is the Supreme Court. So when we talked about the Constitution, we talked about how what the Constitution says about the Supreme Court is pretty minimal, right? The Congress has the power to set up Supreme Court or a federal court system, basically. And then it is the job of the executive to appoint the judges. So on March the 3rd, the day before the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams decides to appoint 16 judges. He does not attend the inauguration. He's one of the few ones to ever do so. He knows that these midnight appointments will be questionable, but these judges will help slow Jefferson down. Even the lawsuits about whether or not these judges can get their jobs will slow Jefferson down. Right? Adams really believes that Jefferson's going to bring about the French Revolution in the United States. So he wants to do anything he can to slow him down. John Marshall, the Secretary of State under John Adams, signs all 16 appointments. So they're legit. Well, the next day, you have James Madison walk in as Secretary of State, sees these appointments and says, yeah, we're not doing that, and throws them all away. Well, we now have a problem here. First of all, John Marshall is our new Supreme Court Chief Justice. He also happens to be Thomas Jefferson's cousin. And so you have a little bit of family rivalry here. There are lots of Supreme Court cases. And honestly, for AP US history, there are fewer that you need to actually know very well than you might expect. However, one of the most, I'd probably say the most important court case, and you must have this one memorized, is Marbury versus Madison. John Marshall is going to serve as essentially the new Hamilton. He is a Federalist through and through. He agrees with basically everything Hamilton ever said. Marshall will serve as Chief Justice for 34 years, and his decisions as Chief Justice will strengthen the central government at the expense of state power. Marshall wants a strong court system to act as a check on the executive and legislative branches. So, in the Judiciary Act of 1789, they create the federal court system. If an official sues an official, it goes to the Supreme Court. Marbury was one of the men appointed to be a judge. He decides to sue James Madison because James Madison never actually gave him his job. He, threw away the appointments. Marshall is left with this conundrum, right? If Marshall favors Marbury, he looks weak because Jefferson's not going to give him the job, right? There's no way Jefferson's going to be like, well, shucks, we got beat this time. I'm going to let this guy become a federal judge. No, he's not going to do that. But if Marshall picks Madison, he looks weak that he doesn't let his own ally in. He doesn't support a fellow Federalist. So what John Marshall does is essentially find a third way. He says, look, Marbury, I would love to give you this job, but as a federal official, you sued under the wrong law. So I can't give it to you. It's on a technicality, right? The decision would be unconstitutional because the Constitution says these court cases need to start in a lower court. So because Marbury jumped straight to the Supreme Court, Marshall says, look, I can't give you the job. Tough luck, buddy. On the other hand, he also establishes this practice of judicial review. Judicial review means that the courts decide whether or not a law is constitutional. So this is a significant defeat for Thomas Jefferson, right? Marshall is saying the courts can strike down legislation. The courts decide what the Constitution means. So states cannot decide when something is unconstitutional. Remember the Kentucky and Virginia Accords. Instead, the courts will decide when a law is unconstitutional. Judicial review is not part of the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution is this ability to judge the constitutionality of laws given to the Supreme Court. But in this first most crucial court case, John Marshall establishes this power for the Supreme Court, and this is so, so important. Well, what's Jefferson's reaction to all of this? It's pretty straightforward. He wants to impeach Marshall. And he's trying to figure out how does the process of impeachment even work? So he decides to first try to impeach Thomas Pickering, right? The guy who led the Essex junto, who was a judge. Pickering's crazy. He didn't wear clothes underneath his judicial robes. And he was successful in doing that. Great. So what about Thomas Jefferson? Well, Thomas Jefferson is going to then try to get rid of a Supreme Court justice. He's going to aim for Justice Samuel Chase, who was a friend of Marshall. He succeeds in getting the House of Representatives to impeach Chase, but the Senate acquits him. Chase had committed no crime. This was a test case for Jefferson, and the fact that he was unable to impeach and get rid of Chase means there's no way he's going to be able to get rid of Marshall. This process, though, of being impeached, of having judges targeted by the president, makes judges less partisan and more cautious. I mean, Marshall is so smart in this. He makes all the judges live in one place, right? He makes them see his way. There's no way that Jefferson's going to be able to woo the judges over. Marshall wins. All right, there's a great crash course, Government, on judicial review. I encourage you to watch it. Judicial review isn't such a crucial process to understand. So what do you think are going to be some of the long-term impacts of judicial review? I'm sure you can think of many very, very important court cases that have changed our country dramatically as a result of judicial review. You may think of Brown v. Board. You may think of Miranda v. Arizona, Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision, right? That's all judicial review. All right, let's go back to Aaron Burr. We haven't talked about him for a while. Remember, he's a slime ball. He was also elected as vice president. So when Hamilton picks Jefferson over Burr, he essentially says, look, Burr's a slime ball. You shouldn't trust him. You shouldn't vote for him. Pick Jefferson. Burr wants Hamilton to publicly apologize. Hamilton says, I'm not doing that. No. So Aaron Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel. They meet in New Jersey. They have their duel. They aim their guns at each other, and Hamilton aims at the sky. He fires into the sky. He wastes his shot purposefully. Burr does not. Burr kills Hamilton and successfully kills his career. Burr's regretful with this, but we have a bit of a problem when you have your current vice president of the United States having been committing murder, right? And there's several witnesses to this. So Aaron Burr flees out west, where he goes on to commit treason right? He tries to bribe General Wilkinson. He wants to declare himself the emperor of Louisiana. He negotiates even with England, right? He's active. Not only is Burr a slimeball, a murderer, he's also a treasonous pig who tries to overthrow the US government, right? He tries to take the Louisiana Territory for himself. He gets arrested for treason, for plotting with England. He does not get convicted. Why? Because according to the Constitution, to be convicted of treason, you need 2 witnesses. And we only had one. The captain on the boat on the Mississippi that saw Burr moving weapons over. There was only one witness to his treasonous act. Therefore, he is not convicted of treason. But obviously, he loses his job and he dies alone. Okay, let's talk a little bit about foreign policy and how bad Thomas Jefferson is at it. You have France and Britain at war again. The Jay Treaty is over. It's a new war. Both Britain and France decide that they want to keep American ships from doing trade with each other, and the US is powerless to stop them. Over 6,000 sailors are impressed. 500 merchant ships are seized by England. Prices are doubled to make up the ships that are seized. A third of the soldiers are captured. Like, it's terrible. In response, Napoleon then goes up to seize 200 American ships, right? If you do trade with France, Britain's going to steal your ships. If you do trade with Britain, France is going to steal your ships. Here's our problem. 70% of our trade was with Britain. So then you have the Chesapeake Leopold incident in 1807. The Chesapeake, a US frigate, was fired upon and boarded by the British ship, the Leopold, on June 22nd, 1807. This is one of the most famous examples of impressments in which the British seized American sailors and forced them to serve on British ships. What do we do? Remember, Jefferson's a pacifist. He got rid of our Navy and Army, right? He doesn't want to go to war. He will not go against the French. Remember, he loves France. He's a Francophile. What would Hamilton suggest in this instance? Get your Navy back and actually start protecting your ships, but he's not willing to do that. So instead, he passes the Embargo Act, which prohibits American ships from leaving their home ports until Britain and France stop restricting trade. Right? He tries an economic solution to a military situation. He hurts our own economy. Right? Basically, it's a ban on all trade of foreign ports. What are the results of this? Well, as you might expect, an economic depression. We have a complete commercial collapse in New England. Massachusetts and Rhode Island are flailing about. I mean, they didn't vote for Jefferson anyway, but this is certainly not helping his cause. You see civil liberties abused as New Englanders become smugglers. They're like, oh no, I'm lost out at sea. I guess I'll just go to Liverpool and trade all the goods on my boat. A ship is forced to rescue the one that is lost. So then there's 2 boats over in England trading goods. Jefferson starts to use the Alien and Sedition Acts against states criticizing him. So then he amends it a little bit. It's such a failure. He switches it to the Non-Intercourse Act, which essentially says, okay, you can do trade with other countries except France and Great Britain. But that's still useless because 70% of our trade is with Britain. Come on. Jefferson, his term's almost up. He leaves office sort of in defeat. He limps home. I mean, he has terrible migraines and indigestion. The embargo failed. It cost 3 times more than just building a navy. Hamilton's plan would have been cheaper. Jefferson sort of discovers how difficult it actually is to govern a country. So he starts his presidency with a bang, right, with the Louisiana Purchase, and ends it with a whimper. He remains popular in the South. Madison gets elected with almost no competition. But his reputation hits an all-time low. And we see a shift here. The revolutionary generation is getting older and dying off. Right? New generation is sending men like Jefferson letters asking, what was the revolution like? Tell us about it. If you remember, Jefferson and Adams had been friends, but then their friendship was really soured and destroyed by politics. So Adams sends a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying, look, I know how they're going to write about the revolution. They're going to say that Ben Franklin took out his lightning rod, smoked the ground, and out of it came George Washington, and the two of them fought their way to victory. He wishes, John Adams writes Jefferson a letter saying, happy birthday. Jefferson responds with a very long and emotional letter. And this starts a long correspondence between the two. Their friendship is healed. Thomas Jefferson dies on July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams dies the exact same day. One's in Massachusetts, one's in Virginia. Our second and third president, the two men who wrote the Declaration of Independence, they both die on July 4th, 50 years after it was signed. It's a beautiful moment, sort of an end of an era. All right, I recommend you watch the 60-second president video on Thomas Jefferson if you have not yet. So I would like you to describe the major events of the Jefferson administration and its impact. And I would encourage you just to dig into Thomas Jefferson's history a little bit more. Maybe there's lots of videos and articles and resources out there about Sally Hemings, about Jefferson and slavery. And just ask yourself, how do we wrestle with these gray areas of history? It would be incorrect to say American history is all evil. We have only ever done terrible things. We committed genocide against the Native Americans. We stole their land. We starved their children. We went back on every agreement. We enslaved millions. We raped and abused. We've only ever done evil things. Because while all those things are true, that does not paint a complete picture of US history. It does not account for the Constitution, this revolutionary form of government, the way that more rights were given to individuals in the United States than in any other country, that if you were going to compare the misdeeds of the United States at that time to other countries, we're certainly not better, but it's not like the United States is an outlier. So when you look at history, you have to take the good and the bad. It would also be incorrect to look at the United States and say, hey, we've never done anything wrong ever. No, US history is full of misdeeds, disappointments, evil acts. History has both good and evil in it, and it would be too simplistic to paint with a broad brush to say someone is all good or all evil. Because when you do that, if you grow up only ever hearing that one interpretation of it, whenever someone offers another interpretation, you will either get defensive, or once you learn about the historical accuracy of those claims, you will feel jaded, like you were lied to. It is better to take the whole messy history of our country and just acknowledge that it's a mess and figure out, okay, but how do we grapple with that mess and acknowledge it, recognize it, and move towards a better future? Thanks for listening, guys. Have a great day.